think like 20 years, 15 years. It's
cool.
like, hey Darren, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you for joining us this early, like it is, I think, 7 your time, 7 a.m. So thank you for joining us. Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so as you said, I've been around for a little while now. I've been working with Microsoft BI technologies for over 20 years. Actually, sort of had to look up what all that went when I applied for a job at a consulting firm back in 1999, and they were working with this beta product called Plato, which turned out to be OLAP services, which was the version that came before analysis services. And so I sort of got in on the ground floor with MDX and multidimensional models, and I've sort of been on that journey ever since, and started with Power Pivot, and then analysis services, Tabular, and now sort of doing a fair bit of stuff with Power BI and DAX and all that sort of stuff. So you're back in.
Great. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, please go on.
Back in 2006, I got my first MVP award. And then in 2010, I took over the local, what was the SQL Server user group. Now it's a Microsoft Data Platform user group here in Melbourne. It's been a little bit quiet during the last few months of COVID, but I'm looking to sort of reboot that with some virtuals presentations. We're still sort of a bit restricted on in-person meetings here in Australia, although not as bad as the rest of the world, so it's pretty good here at the moment. And in my free time, I work on a little side project called DAX Studio, which
just a little, very little project.
Yeah.
Great. That's fantastic. Thank you for that great introduction. And let's jump into the discussion of DAX Studio. So a lot of our audience already know about DAX Studio. They used it. Some of them, however, might not hear about it. So would you mind showing us what DAX Studio is? If you have any demos ready, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I can start sort of sharing my screen, and I thought we can start right back at the beginning. So
that's good. And if you can minimize that little window of Teams,
I can get rid of
that one. Yeah, that's fantastic. If anyone have any questions, just feel free to let us know, and then I'll let Darren know about that.
Yeah, so this is the website for the project, daxstudio.org, and I've got a big green download button where you can grab the latest version. There's both an installer, and underneath that there's a portable version. So this is the version that was released a couple of weeks ago, and as you can see, we've already had 11,000 people update to the latest version. I think the last sort of long stable version I had that was up for about 6 months, we got up to about 40,000 downloads, so it's fairly popular little tool. I try and put all of the there's a few key features on the homepage, and I try and keep the feature lists of the site updated with all of the features and screenshots and things where I can. You can see I've even got a little visual of how the different caching works in Power BI. So that's where you can get DAX Studio from. And DAX Studio, in a nutshell, is a way of just working with raw DAX queries. You can connect to your tabular model and see the tables and measures and columns and run queries. So the simplest way to get started once you've downloaded and installed, and I've got a AdventureWorks, which I did have a crash just before the Power BI just before we got started, but hopefully the demo gods will be kind on us and it'll behave itself. So normally when you start Power BI and open up a file. If you've installed DAX Studio or one of the other products that supports the external tools ribbon, you can see on this on my home PC, I've got DAX Studio and Tabular Editor, so it appears in external tools. So this this whole ribbon only lights up when you've got one of the tools installed. There's a special location where they write a little file out that has the icon and the path to their program. So if the easiest way with Power BI is to install DAX Studio using the default install and then launch Power BI, and we have a little button, and when we click that, that'll launch DAX Studio. And you can see I've got the DAX Studio window over the top. You can hold down Control and mouse wheel to zoom in. You can see that the tables here over on the left in the DAX Studio view, and the all the different columns sort of matches what's in Power BI here on the right. And if you click, you'll see the same sort of list of tables. And so I'll make DAX Studio full screen now that we've sort of shown we're seeing the same model. Yeah, and you may have noticed as I was just mousing around, we've got a few extra things in DAX Studio. So hovering over a table gives me both the, it gives you a name, and if there's a description, the description will appear in there, and it gives you a count of columns, measures, and the number of rows in that table. And as you go down the different columns, it'll give you some different information, such as the distinct values, max and min values, and sort of a little top 10 list of the values, so you can see very quickly sort of what, if you don't know, if you can't remember if customer ID is an integer or a string, you can hover over it. You can quickly see what sort of sample data you've got in there and what format the data is.
It's very helpful feature, actually. I wish Power BI also copied that from you guys.
Yeah, I've used that frequently when writing queries, because I go, oh, state, did I put that in as Victoria or as Vic, which is the state I'm in? So did I use the 3-letter abbreviation or the full name? And especially if I'm working with someone else's model, it can be very helpful. And one thing that's added in the latest release, I added this this little help text to the main screen, because it could be quite sort of daunting when you just launch DAX Studio and it used to just be a white screen. So there was we added a little bit of help for new users, so you can start a simple query with evaluate, and I've got a bunch of other example queries on the website that you can link up. But you can start off as simply as just evaluate. You can see we've got IntelliSense, and I could use the products table. And I can click the run button in the top left, and down the bottom we've got all of our product information. So that's just a list of all of the rows in the product table, and right down the bottom you can see that it gives you information about how long the query took and how many rows were returned. It's got information about the this is the actual server and port number that I'm connected to. So Power BI starts up a little local server on a random port. So it's currently on 5070.719. And that will change each time. Even if I open the same file, it'll get a new port. And that other number there is the version of the engine that we're connected to. So the analysis services engine that's sitting behind Power BI is currently 15.1.76.20. So that can be interesting if you're comparing stuff with colleagues and getting slightly different behaviors. So yeah, and the other thing we've got that's interesting when you're getting started, and I'm actually finding that I'm using a fair bit myself is the query builder. So you can launch it from this link on the help text, and there's also a button up the top here in the ribbon. So this is a fairly new addition. It's only sort of added in the last few months. So I think in the 2.14 series of releases, I've sort of released that button publicly. Before that, it was a preview feature. The DAX Studio has a whole bunch of options, sort of as we've gone through things we've added. As we had different bits of functionality, if there's a couple of ways of doing things, or if there's things like certain timeouts, they're all here in the options. One thing we'll have a look at later on is this tracing functionality. And we have had some of the Azure sources, like the Power BI XMLA endpoint you can use with Premium or Azure analysis services. Sometimes the traces can be a little bit slow to respond when you first start them up. So you can increase this trace timeout up to a couple of minutes or something, and that usually sorts that out. I don't think I've got. Oh yeah, I've got a preview. The only preview I've got at the moment is for the key bindings, which is where you can customize some of the common commands. We did have a issue raised on our site where some of the different keyboard layouts in Europe conflicted with some of the defaults key bindings we've chosen and made it difficult to type some things. So I have added a way for that to be changed. I don't currently have sort of validations on here to stop you from trying to bind two keys to the same, or two commands to the same key. So I'm sort of been trying to figure out a good way of doing that with the controls I've set up here. But that's the main reason why it's still sort of in a preview feature. It's not quite completely baked. I'm still trying to add some validation and things to that, but otherwise it does work quite well. And there's full sort of search support. So if you don't know which one of these categories there's settings are in, you can search for them. And there's all sorts of different things like the metadata pane. You can actually turn off that showing of the top 10 values, because we do run a little give me top 10. So if you're running against a big model or something, you may want to switch that off, because the queries run as you do the mouse over. But the tabular engine is such an amazingly fast engine that I usually leave a lot of this stuff just on default. Another thing that's sort of helpful is we've got a detection of changes. So by default for AS Azure and Power BI, I've turned that off because sometimes they can take 30 or 40 seconds to do a refresh of the discovery of the metadata. But if I'll show you what I mean by that. So what we've got is, example in sales here, I've got a total sales measure. You can see when I hover over the measure, I get the format string and information about that. If I go into Power BI, so this is the same file we're connected to. In DAX Studio, you can see there's total sales. If I just going to put a hard-coded 2 in there just so it's, you can see over here on the right that a little test measure, oh, and I've used the wrong key. Test measure has been added in Power BI. As soon as I click back on DAX Studio, it should, so if you blinked, you've missed it, but it just refreshed. And so that measure I just added in Power BI, there, which just returns a static 2, is already in the metadata list. And up the top here, I've used the curly braces, which gives me an inline table constructor, so I can do evaluate and then just return the value for the measure. which is quite a handy way of sort of testing things. Because I know sometimes people make the mistake of just trying to evaluate a measure which gives you an error. Having trouble double scrolling there. So yeah, it tells you the expression is not a valid table expression. So you need to make sure you've got something that returns a table. The other thing I've got is that if you, these errors, especially where it's got query 1, so it's got a location, line 1, character 1. I'm getting a lot of noise on the chat, Reza. Is that coming from you or is that?
No, I don't hear anything from here. Let me just
It's...
turn off my microphone just in case. Just in case.
Yeah, it's just a lot of background noise. I don't know if it's going to the feed or if it's just coming to me. So yeah, when there's query, and this is saying there's an error on line 1, position 1, you can see it's highlighted the area where the error occurred, which is evaluate. You can also double click on these. So if you had an example where you had you might have been filtering the values from product colors. And you might have wanted to do where the product color is red, and if I leave the closing brackets off and tried to run that, it's giving me that. It's actually had trouble parsing that because that's one of the you see it's given that the end of input was reached. One of the interesting things about the tabular engine is it actually understands 4 different languages. It can understand MDX, DAX, DMX, and a small subset of SQL. So sometimes if you miss, if you do something like forget a bracket, you get a weird error like the end of input was reached, and that's because it's not 100% sure whether you meant to type something in DAX or MDX because the syntax is not complete. You get this strange error, and that's just because they've got quite a complex parser and stuff they've got. That's trouble with doing a. Yeah, so there we go. So this is now. I've got an invalid value here. I've got this just a random A and then the word red, and you can see it's down here. It's saying query 1 at character 66. The syntax for red is incorrect. If I double click on that, it'll take the cursor straight up to where the issue is in my query. And you can see it's going, well, I don't understand this open quotes after this this A constant. So I was sort of, before I got distracted on that little tangent, I was going to show you guys the query builder. So that's another way of, rather than having to hand type all of your DAX, you can open that. So you can either click from there or from up here on the ribbon. So from there, we can either drag and drop information. So I can grab category and color, zoom in to make that a bit bigger. What else could we grab? So we could grab like the state province for customer. So in theory, I could even try and run, I've got a query here that's got 2 columns from product and a column from customer. If you did try and run that, it does pop up a bit of a warning because this is a bit of an anti-pattern, is just including a list of columns with no measures. There's no way for the engine to summarize and aggregate, so all it can do is cross-join all of the rows from customer with all of the rows from product. So we give you a little warning saying, are you really sure you want to do that? So normally you'd want at least one measure in a query, or if all of the columns are from just a single table. So if we just had category and color, that would be all right, because they're sort of related to each other in the one table. Actually, I don't want test measure because that's grab total sales. So we click run, and there's our results with all of the 564 rows that come from that combination of sales for color, category, and state province. So down the bottom there are two buttons. You can either run the query or edit the query. When you click edit query, it takes these selections you've made over here and brings it up in the editor. So from there you can do further edits. You can change the columns. I can delete that out. And then the only trick then is that there's now two run buttons on screen. The one in the left here will run the text that you've edited in the edit pane over here on the right, and the one down the bottom will run anything that's in the current selection, so I can run that. So that's just a little trick, because we've now got two ways of effectively generating a query to send to the engine, either this edited version, where I've taken out state province, so you can see I've only got category and color, or if I click the run down here, I get the three columns. So that's just and I have made it so that if this window is completely blank, you can click sort of either run button and both do the same thing. So in addition to be able to drag columns and measures, you can also drag them into the filters area. I do also have some hotkeys. So you can type C to add it to the columns area, or an F to add it to filters, or a B to add something to both columns and filters. So that lets you build up a query from the keyboard. So I should be able to type in category and then type C to send it to the columns, and you can see it clears the search list. And then I want to do color, and maybe I want a down arrow, and then push B to send it both to up here to columns and down here to color. And I might want to search for where it contains red. There's a bunch of options you can choose. Starts with. If you want to do a list, you can do in. So then I can just do the different entries on a new line. And then I might want to get our total sales, and I can go down and do C for columns. And so then very quickly, with just typing and using those hotkeys, you can build up a query. If I run that query, you can see it's just got the red and blacks, and you can click edit query to see how it's done that, and it's used a treat as with a table constructor over the two values, red and black. If we switch this, maybe it contains the letters RE. We can clear that out and then click edit query again, and now it's doing a filter over all colors, and it's using the search to find if these two RE characters appear in the product color column, and if the position of those is anything greater than or equal to 1, it returns true in the filter. So you can see the different patterns for how it goes and generates those sorts of queries.
We got a comment from Donald saying that the query builder is a hit with my business analyst to build DAX for Excel tables. Definitely a useful feature.
Yeah, because you can very quickly see the output of measures and just drag and drop. So it's very similar to the sort of the way you could build a table in Power BI. But I think it's a little bit faster, and yeah, it gives you that. You can be a business analyst. I want to dump out a table looking at category, color, and total sales. I also use it for creating measures. So you can see here I've got total sales. There's a little. I can either edit an existing measure. So if I say my total sales is wrong, it should be 10% of that, so multiply by 1.1. In fact, let's multiply it by something big so that we can see that change. I'm going to just clear out this so it doesn't confuse us. So what have we got at the moment? We've got like black components. Oh no, this is the old query. So it'll bring back red. So this red component, 1.6 million, that should come out to 6 times that. Yeah, which has come out now to 10 million. So I can edit and develop measures and take that off. So this should go back to the 1 million odd for red components. Yeah, that 1.6. And all this is doing when we did that multiply by a value, is it's injecting this define clause in the query. So it's not actually changing anything at all in your model. You can change it, fine tune the logic as much as you like in DAX Studio without altering anything in Power BI. So it's a good way of testing, prototyping, developing things without making any changes. You can tweak an existing model. You can click the new button and add a brand new measure. So we might want to grab maybe like the sum. Okay, I should make that bigger, shouldn't I? I keep forgetting. So that would be a total price. Technically, when you create a DAX measure, it needs to be assigned to a table of some sort. That's just a way the syntax works. It doesn't actually matter because this name has to be unique within the model. It doesn't really matter which table it's assigned to. It's nice to, my measures in I'm summing from sales, so I usually like to put the measure in sales unless I've got a separate measures table. So there you can see that we've now got a total price. The other interesting thing to pick up is that you can see that total sales is formatted and total price isn't. This formatting comes from Power BI. So when you've specified the measure and formatted it up the top here as a currency, that's what DAX Studio's picked up. But that actually comes because we've matched the column header with the name of a measure, so we've been able to apply the formatting. Change that to total sales 2. We now lose the formatting because it doesn't now match the name. So all of the results from a DAX query come back raw and unformatted like this, and the formatting is done by the client tool. So Power BI, when it sends stuff, it knows exactly which column is coming back and forth because it built the query. In DAX Studio, because you can hand type the query and you can do things like rename total sales to total sales 2. It's a bit harder for me to map back which measure this name was linked to. So even though within summarized columns it's easy, but you can quite quickly build more complicated structures where it becomes a lot harder to track the lineage in DAX Studio. So that's one use of DAX Studio, with sort of just the getting started. I know quite a popular thing people do is we've been looking at output into the grid. We've got a bunch of different output options. You can output to the timer output is sort of an older one. The timer output is actually just sort of like a null output. We don't actually display the output anywhere, so you could run the query and just capture timings without having to populate the grid. So if you're testing a large query with millions of records, it takes time to be able to populate and bind those into this grid. So you can change the timer, and that would just run the query and not display any results. In fact, that's just holding the results there from the query builder from last time. You can send it to clipboard if you want to be able to paste it into something. You can send it to a file. So if we run that query, it'll pop up a little option, and I can output to a CSV or tab separated. Also like a so there's a default CSV which puts quotes around text string fields, and there's a tab separated option, and there's a custom export format which you can configure in the options whether or not you want quotes and what sort of delimiter you want to use. So that can be a good way of just dumping a file out from a query. And we've got both linked and static Excel. These two options used to just work from our Excel add-in. So the Excel add-in was actually where DAX Studio started, because at the time, Power Pivot was the only tabular engine that existed. And because we were running in Excel, we could send results. The linked one would create a query, a table in Excel that was linked back to the data model, and the static would just write out static cells. So when I'm running here connected to Power BI, it does almost the same thing. The static will generate a XLSX file with all of the results in it. The linked version will generate an ODC file, which is something that lets Excel know how to connect to the local data model. In the case of Power BI, it's sort of a one-off because it will it has to use this port down the bottom, which gets randomized each time you open it. So with Power BI Desktop, that linked option is a little bit less valuable than if you're working against one of the data sources that has a fixed connection, like analysis services on-prem or the Power BI XML endpoint or Azure analysis services. All of those, you've got a fixed server name that you can connect to, and so when you reopen the file, it'll be connected back. But this linked will create an empty pivot table that you can then do Excel type drag and drop transformations.
That was
Yeah, so they're all the different outputs, and I know people like being able to run a query and output it to a CSV file and then pass it to some other process. I actually did a little bit of that recently with one of our data scientists at work needed an input to be able to do some experimentation in R. So that was the easiest way to get him some stuff that had been transformed through Power Query, and we'd added some extra measures and stuff, and he wanted all of that output, but he wanted to be able to get it direct into R, so we could just quickly dump it out to a CSV, and off he went with that. So that was handy.
That's great. Thank you for showing that. I feel a lot of people using it already.
Yeah.
Like one of the other things quite helpful for DAX Studio, many people using it, is actually like checking the performance, server timing, and things like that. Can you go around that a little bit? I know this is not going to be like a performance tuning session, but just talking about those metrics and how that works. Sorry if I'm jumping ahead, or
no.
Take your time. I'm just I'm just pointing something.
No, it's a good segue. I was just getting to that. I was thinking we sort of covered the query builder, which is good to get started, and the output, and then I was that was going to be my next point.
Awesome.
Was moving up to the traces. So yeah, we're both on the same wavelength.
Good, thank you.
So what we've got, yeah, one of the other big features of DAX Studio that's really handy is this traces pane up the top here. So we've got 3 different traces. Server timings and query plan listen to the current DAX Studio session that we've got here. So even the current document, so you can see I'm connected to query 1. I can open a new query window, which is probably another interesting aside. So this is where you can see here I was connected to a Azure Analysis Services instance, and it remembers a bunch of different ones. The top option here, Power Pivot, only works when you've launched from Excel. So Power Pivot has no external connectivity. You need to be running an Excel to connect to a Power Pivot model. So that's why we've got the Excel add-in. So when you launch from a Excel that has a workbook open with a Power Pivot model, this option at the top lights up. But if you've got Power BI or SQL Server Developer tools with a tabular model in it, I actually opened up 2, so you can see we're working with AdventureWorks in today, but I've also got a second file open. And using this connect option, you can choose which one of those 2 to connect to. But these are 2 separate connections. So even if I did connect back to AdventureWorks and I see the same thing, I can have a trace running in one window and not in the other window. So these query plan and server timings listen to just the current session in DAX Studio. And this first option here, all queries, that pretty much captures every query. That can be quite handy. It'll capture every query being hit, being executed by any client. So if you've got Excel clients or report builder clients hitting your analysis services engine, you can capture that with the all queries trace and see all of the different queries that run. But the server timings and query plans are used a lot for performance tuning. So if we click Start Server Timings, you'll see a little tab appears down the bottom near the results. Depending on the engine you're connected to, that can sometimes, because it's a local Power BI, it's quite fast. You'll see here when we click the button, it's like my local time 7:38:01. It took roughly 4 seconds for that to start up. So while I was zooming in and out, it already started. As I mentioned before, some of the Azure Analysis Services and Power BI XMLA, they can go even longer than the default 30-second timeout at the moment. So I was sort of chatting to the product team, and I think they were looking at trying to improve that startup time. But at the moment, you can increase the timeout because, yeah, sometimes it does say it timed out because DAX Studio starts a trace, and then we fire a couple of little, we just fire a little discover cubes command at the moment and wait until we hear that come back because the trace, you say create trace and the returns immediate says it's created, but it doesn't start capturing events for a few seconds. It takes a few seconds for it to get start feeding back events. So it's possible to click server timings, click play, and if we didn't have that little polling mechanism, you could miss some of the start events. So we do that little poll to make sure we've started capturing events, which is why it can take a few seconds here for it to register the trace start. So that comes up with a little screen, which is currently empty because we haven't run any queries. So I can run this query builder query, and it captures all the information about the query, and all of the information here is captured from events sent back from the engine. So there's no if you are connected to Azure Analysis Services or some remote server, there's no network latency. There's no transferring of data. It doesn't matter how big the data set is. This is all these timings and all this information is coming from the server. So this is the time it took the engine to process each of these events. So what we have here is a couple of different scan events. And first one here, this is using a language called XM SQL. So it looks very like SQL, but it's actually just a text representation of the object graph of operations that the storage engine performed. So inside the tabular engine that runs your data model, there are actually two internal components to the query engine. There's the formula engine, which is this FE. So the formula engine understands DAX. The formula engine can do very complicated sort of DAX expressions, but it doesn't have direct access to the data. When it needs data, it talks to the storage engine, and the storage engine is linked to that Vertipack layer, and it's extremely fast, but it only does simple operations. So the query comes into the formula engine, it parses it, it figures out, I need to get a list of colors to figure out, what to filter by. And then it's done if I can switch this, you see there's an extra layouts tab when I'm running a trace. The bottom layout might give us a bit more room. So you can see that, the top one's just done a list, select product colors from product, and the bottom one here is done the actual query that's figured out. And interestingly, you can see that it's from this first query, it's done the this filter. So this has generated a tell me where color contains R and E. So this first scan, it said the storage engine, the simple storage engine, can't do a contains and search. So it's passed a list back of colors. The formula engine then has just figured out that, there are only two colors that have R and E in them, red and gray. So it's then passed that as the next query to the storage engine, give me red and gray. So it hasn't actually done the, if we edit the query, it hasn't done search. All of that's been handled in the formula engine. You can't see any of this search to find the position and then check if the position is greater than or equal to 1. It's transformed all of that into this sort of operation against the storage engine. So give me the red and gray. And you can see the breakdown. The storage engine, because this model is so small, the storage engine was 0 milliseconds, so it didn't really register, and the formula engine was 3, so it's sort of saying it took 100% of the time in the formula engine, but pretty much anything under sort of 10 milliseconds is, it could be noise on your computer. Your antivirus could kick in a scan and easily delay it by 10 seconds or something. So but on bigger queries, typically you want to try and push as much of the work as you can to the storage engine because it's fast, multi-threaded. The formula engine is sort of single-threaded and does more complex operations. But at the same time, it's a bit of a balancing act because you can see here we only had 2 storage engine queries, which is fine. The reverse of that is you don't want to generate thousands of storage engine because then it just gets chatty between the 2 engines and that can generate slowdowns. So ideally, you want to get the lowest number of storage engine queries you can and get most of the evaluation in the storage engine, but you will always get some in the formula engine because that's the entry point into that's the first component that accepts the DAX query. And you probably want to try and, if you can, come up with patterns that minimize the number of rows that are scanned because that gives you sort of an indication of the amount of temporary memory that may have needed to be used to materialize some of the result sets. So in this case, the distinct color list is pretty small and there are only 13 rows. So that can be a good way of seeing what's going on. The other thing I've seen, get rid of these two measures. So the other thing I've seen is where people will debate if there's a difference between doing something like a switch and a sum, or so there are a couple of different ways you could do sort of conditional logic. So great pattern to do sum x over an entire table, but it's not going to matter too much because we're doing AdventureWorks, which is so tiny it's pretty hard to come up with an example that has a performance issue. So if I come up with a scenario where we want to, say we want to look at, create a measure that counts sales above $500, and we're going to call this is our large sales. So I'm going to grab the sales amount column. So if that's greater than 500, then I want to return that column. Otherwise, I don't want to return anything. So I could close the if statement there. So that's one approach. Let's get up our screen. So I'm going to have a look at the query plan. So that's added a separate query plan option down here, and we get a physical and a logical query plan. Actually, I might take that's, you can see here there's filter operations, so I might simplify this query just a bit more just by getting rid of the filter. Cool, so we can see it's sort of done a join, and you can see there's an if operation in here, and you can actually see it's doing it's comparing a column value to a constant. So that's sort of what you'd expect. So initially when they built the tabular engine, if was sort of, it was sort of a basic implementation. So it would run, it would always run both the true and the false side of the expression. So it would evaluate, if you had two measures here, it would evaluate both these measures and then figure out if this condition was true or false to figure out which one to return, which is simple and works all the time. But if both sides of your if expression are doing heavy complex logic, it means you're running double the load, even though for each given cell that's returned, you only need one of those two values. So now they're actually doing what they call short circuit evaluation, where it figures out, is this true or false, and then it will evaluate the relevant argument. But in the initial version of the engine, that wasn't always the case. So you may see, you'll sometimes see people saying, oh, you should steer away from if. And so what a lot of people would do is they would then say, okay, if has performance issues, so I'll use switch. So you can use switch with a true parameter and say, so when this is true, it'll evaluate the sales amount. Otherwise, it'll return blank. So I think I've got that. Let's find out if I make any sales mistakes, any syntax errors. So that's effectively the same logic, just rewritten as switch. But if you look at our query plan, we've actually got an if, and we've got the same column value and constant. So internally, switch is just rewritten by the engine as a series of nested ifs. So everyone that was trying to get extra performance by rewriting their if logic using switch, you can prove categorically by looking at the query plan that it actually, internally, the operations that get run are identical between a switch, equivalent switch and if statement. So yeah, so that's one use. Typically, especially for larger queries, the query plans get very difficult to read. More often than not, I mainly use server timings, looking at the number of queries and some of the information in the queries to figure out stuff. Interestingly, you can see here highlighted that as this storage engine has gone through, it's actually, this callback data ID is where the storage engine has actually had to call back to the formula engine to say, hey, I don't know what to do with this switch. So this is one case where the two engines talk back the other way. So that this, as it's gone through each row, it's called back to the formula engine. The storage engine said, hey, formula engine, tell me what the answer to this expression is, because this is not something I know how to deal with. So that's one potential thing to look out and avoid if you can. But there are valid operations, and they've actually sort of optimized this this sort of flow of stuff quite well. But you can see introducing this has added a bit of latency into our storage engine, although we're still in the sub 10 milliseconds, so it's quite hard for these timings to get accurate. And so in fact, along those lines, I've actually got in the advanced tab, there's a benchmark tool. I'm just thinking the benchmark tool, no, it should pick up the query builder. So if I click run on that, we'll see here this is a 5 millisecond query. If I run a benchmark, what the benchmark will do is do a repeated run of your query. So the default is it'll run 5 cold cache executions. So it'll run in between each execution, it runs a clear cache to flush the local storage engine cache, and then it runs 5 executions without the doing clear cache in between to get sort of a warm cache measurement. And so this feature is actually using the server timings tab and collecting the stats that come back from that. So this can be an easy way to do a more statistical measurement, because you can get a number of queries and you can turn this off and just run cold or just run warm cache. But you can see here, this is a very simple query and had an average of 4.8 seconds, a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 5. And in this case, it's the caching made like no difference, the warm and the cold. You'll normally see the warm cache being faster because there's a little bit of stuff being cached by the storage engine between repeated calls. But in this case, such a simplistic query that it's not showing us any of that, but that's where you can find this information. So if you want more than just the total duration and storage engine and these high level things, we've also got detailed stats for all of the 10 executions that were run, the 5 cold and 5 warm. And these are all of the stats collected from these server timing tabs. So that's another quite handy feature. So sort of getting close to the hour, Rez. Did you...
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that was great explanation of different parts of DAX Studio, and
yeah,
we had Donald saying that benchmark seems to be nice. Yeah, definitely useful for checking the performance of your query, and he was saying that he'd be using var variables basically to try to keep from evaluating if branch twice.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the switch method with true you mentioned is like one of the common ways of like implementing if but in a switch mechanism. That was great explanation. I think we are like almost at our time. Like we have 5 minutes, but if there's
Yeah.
any questions, I'll let you know. Is there anything else you would like to mention in this last 5 minutes?
Yeah, I was just conscious because I have to be careful because I can talk for hours on tech, and there's a lot of other sort of features in there. I was sort of hoping to be able to get to. We do have parameter support, which can be handy for working with queries for.
Maybe we can do another session sometime later with that.
Yeah, that could be interesting.
Yeah, we'll love to have you back again here. And
because I've
audience.
done. There are other videos on Power BI tips, and I did one with Reed Havens, where I actually showed that. That was a couple of weeks ago, and I showed what Donald mentioned, where you can use capture variables to avoid things being evaluated twice, and we sort of measured that in server timings. And I think I started off with a query that was 800 milliseconds. I mean, so it's still fast, but we got it down to 77 milliseconds in the end. So it was
that's great.
So it was like a 10-fold improvement. Just going through different ways of building the measure and looking at things like variables and the server timings to see what the different patterns did and which ones are more efficient. So you can sort of, rather than just going by feel, which can be hard in Power BI because of, I mean, there's layers of cache in Power BI. There's like visual cache on the Power BI surface, as well as caches before the engine, caches inside the data engine. So it can be quite hard to get a handle on performance, but you can actually measure it objectively using DAX Studio.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Awesome. That was great. Hopefully we'll get you sometime later for that parameters also, looking at how that works. Thank you again for your time. I get a lot of comments here that a lot of people liked it. So thank you again. This will be available for watching later on as well. And hopefully we'll get you sometime later to talk about those parameters and how we use that in DAX Studio.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Thank you. And have a good rest of your day. Have a good day, everyone attending as well. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.